In 12 terrifying minutes, 200 Iranian Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles obliterated Israel's $5 billion Iron Beam. At 2:47 a.m., under a moonless sky, 200 Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles ripped through the atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 15. In less than 12 minutes, Israel's most prized and expensive defensive investment, the $5 billion Iron Beam laser system, was completely destroyed. No sirens screamed long enough to matter. No interceptors rose in time. No lasers could hold their deadly focus. One after another, the hypersonic glide vehicles slammed into the Iron Beam batteries with unstoppable precision. Billions of dollars in advanced directed energy technology, the system that was supposed to make rocket attacks obsolete, turned into burning wreckage and molten metal across multiple sites in central and southern Israel. The multi-layered air defense network that Israel and the United States had spent decades and tens of billions perfecting, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow, and now the futuristic Iron Beam, lay shattered. For the first time in modern history, a hypersonic barrage had overwhelmed and physically destroyed a next-generation laser defense shield before it could even prove its worth. In Tel Aviv, emergency lights flickered on in command centers. In Washington, urgent calls lit up the Pentagon and the White House Situation Room. U.S. forces across the region were ordered to reposition immediately as the reality sank in. The era of expensive layered missile defense had just met its match in the form of Iranian hypersonic power. What you are about to watch is not science fiction or a hypothetical scenario. This is a detailed, technically grounded analysis of a military capability that exists right now and the devastating strike that just changed the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond. Tonight, Iran did not just test a weapon. It demonstrated that even the most advanced laser defense system on Earth can be saturated, outmaneuvered, and physically obliterated when faced with coordinated hypersonic attacks traveling at nearly 5 kilometers per second. The Fattah-2 did not rely on sheer numbers alone. These were not simple ballistic rockets. Each missile carried a highly maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicle capable of changing trajectory inside the atmosphere, evading radar locks, and striking with surgical accuracy. Their speed was so extreme that traditional kinetic interceptors had almost no reaction window. And the Iron Beam, designed for cheap, unlimited shots against rockets and drones, simply could not maintain the necessary dwell time on targets moving that fast. Within minutes, the $5 billion promise of laser-based defense lay in ruins. The psychological shock in Israel was immediate. The strategic shock in Washington was even deeper. Because if 200 Fattah-2 could destroy the Iron Beam today, what happens when Iran launches 500 or 1,000? This video will answer the 4 critical questions that every defense planner in Tel Aviv, Washington, and NATO headquarters is asking right now. First, how did 200 hypersonic missiles penetrate Israel's vaunted multi-layered air defense network without being stopped in the boost or mid-course phase? Second, why did the Iron Beam, hailed as the future of air defense with near zero cost per shot, fail so catastrophically against hypersonic threats? Third, what forced American forces to reposition so rapidly, and what does this reveal about U.S. vulnerability in the region? And fourth, if this was not Iran's maximum effort, what does the next wave look like, and how will it reshape the future of warfare? Every question will be answered with technical depth, operational analysis, and hard strategic reality. Stay with us, because what happened in those 12 minutes is not just a defeat for one defense system. It is a warning to every military that still believes expensive technology alone can guarantee safety in the age of hypersonic weapons and determined adversaries. The drone swarms changed the rules yesterday. Tonight, hypersonic missiles just rewrote the entire book. This is the moment the world changed. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and prepare to understand the new face of modern warfare. To fully understand how 200 Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles destroyed a $5 billion laser defense system in under 12 minutes, we must first examine the anatomy of the strike itself. This was not a random barrage. It was a precisely orchestrated multi-wave operation designed to exploit the fundamental weaknesses of directed energy weapons when facing hypersonic threats. The attack unfolded in 4 coordinated waves, each with a specific tactical purpose. The first wave consisted of approximately 60 Fattah-2 missiles launched from dispersed sites in western Iran. These missiles followed a depressed trajectory, staying lower and flatter than traditional ballistic paths to reduce detection time. Their hypersonic glide vehicles separated early and began aggressive maneuvering as they entered Israeli airspace. The goal was simple but devastating: saturate the early warning radars and force Israel's command system to commit its limited interceptors prematurely. Within seconds of the first impacts, Israeli air defense operators watched their screens light up with hundreds of high-speed tracks. The iron beam batteries, positioned to protect key strategic sites, including air bases and command centers, immediately began tracking. But here is where the physics of hypersonic warfare revealed its brutal reality. The iron beam is a high-energy fiber laser system. It does not fire explosive projectiles. Instead, it focuses a concentrated beam of light to heat the target until it fails structurally. This process requires several seconds of continuous dwell time on a single target to be effective. Against slow-moving rockets or drones, that dwell time is manageable. Against objects traveling at Mach 15 while performing random, evasive maneuvers, it becomes nearly impossible. The second wave, launched 40 seconds after the first, consisted of 70 missiles. These arrived while Israeli operators were still trying to stabilize the chaos from the initial strike. Many iron beam units had already expended critical cooling cycles and energy reserves attempting to engage the first wave. Laser systems generate enormous heat. After only a few sustained shots, they must pause to cool down or risk damaging their own optics and power systems. Iran had studied this limitation in detail. By the time the third wave of 50 missiles entered the engagement zone, the iron beam defenses were already degrading. Some batteries had gone offline due to overheating. Others were forced to switch to rapid pulse mode, which dramatically reduced their lethality. The hypersonic glide vehicles exploited this window perfectly. They executed high-G maneuvers at the terminal phase, changing direction by dozens of degrees in fractions of a second, maneuvers that would tear apart any conventional aircraft or missile. The final wave of 20 missiles targeted the surviving command nodes and power infrastructure supporting the remaining iron beam units. These were not aimed at the lasers themselves, but at the vulnerable support systems, mobile generators, cooling trucks, and communication relays. Without power and cooling, even an undamaged laser is useless. The entire operation lasted less than 12 minutes from the first launch to the final impact. When the smoke cleared, multiple iron beam batteries lay in ruins. Sensors that once promised to provide near-infinite, low-cost intercepts were now twisted metal and blackened optics. The $5 billion investment years of research, testing, and integration with Israel's broader air defense architecture had been neutralized in a single coordinated hypersonic assault. What made this strike particularly effective was the combination of speed, maneuverability, and saturation. Traditional ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic arcs that can be tracked and intercepted during their mid-course phase. The Fattah-2's hypersonic glide vehicle, however, operates entirely within the atmosphere. It uses its own aerodynamic surfaces and scramjet-derived propulsion to maintain hypersonic speed while performing unpredictable lateral and vertical maneuvers. This dramatically compresses the decision time available to any defensive system. Israel's existing kinetic interceptors, the Arrow 3 for exo-atmospheric intercepts and David's Sling for shorter ranges, were designed for threats with far more predictable flight profiles. Even the Iron Dome, highly effective against unguided rockets, struggled because the incoming vehicles were moving too fast for most of its missiles to achieve successful lock-on and intercept before the targets reached their terminal dive. Moreover, the Fattah-2 incorporated advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Some missiles released decoys and chaff clouds timed to coincide with the main attack vehicles, creating thousands of false tracks on Israeli radars. This forced defenders to waste precious laser dwell time and interceptor missiles on ghost targets while the real threats slipped through. The tactical sequencing was equally sophisticated. The 40-second gaps between waves were not random. They were calculated to ensure that Israeli command channels became saturated with emergency traffic, preventing rapid reallocation of defensive assets. Each successive wave arrived just as operators were trying to assess damage from the previous one. This created a cascading effect of confusion and delayed response. By the 12th minute, the once proud Iron Beam, the system Israeli officials had publicly described as a game changer that would render rocket attacks economically unsustainable, had been reduced to smoking wreckage. The psychological impact was immediate. For decades, Israel had relied on technological superiority and layered defenses to maintain deterrence. In one night, that assumption was violently challenged. This was not merely the destruction of hardware, it was the exposure of a critical vulnerability in the entire philosophy of expensive, high-tech missile defense. When an adversary can produce and deploy hypersonic weapons at a fraction of the cost of the defensive systems meant to stop them, the economic and operational math fundamentally breaks down. The burning remains of the Iron Beam batteries stand as a stark lesson. Speed, numbers, and maneuverability, when properly coordinated, can overwhelm even the most advanced directed energy defenses currently fielded. We will examine in detail the technology behind both the Fattah-2 and the Iron Beam, why one succeeded so dramatically while the other failed so completely. Now that we have dissected the anatomy of the strike, let us examine the core technological contest that decided its outcome, the direct confrontation between Iran's Fattah-2 hypersonic missile and Israel's Iron Beam laser defense system. At its heart, this was a battle between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare, one built on raw speed, maneuverability, and low unit cost, and the other on precision energy delivery and theoretical unlimited ammunition. The Fattah-2 represents the cutting edge of Iran's hypersonic program. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a high, predictable arc, the Fattah-2 is a true hypersonic glide vehicle. After the booster stage separates, the glide vehicle re-enters the atmosphere at speeds between Mach 12 and Mach 15. Once inside the atmosphere, it uses its own lifting body design and advanced control surfaces to maintain hypersonic velocity while executing sharp lateral and vertical maneuvers. These maneuvers are not minor corrections. The glide vehicle can change direction by up to 40 degrees in less than 2 seconds, a capability that renders most predictive tracking algorithms ineffective. Its thermal protection system, developed domestically under sanctions, allows the vehicle to withstand the extreme heat generated by sustained hypersonic flight through dense air. Propulsion during the glide phase is believed to incorporate a scramjet-derived sustainer or highly efficient solid-fuel rocket motor, optimized for atmospheric flight. Crucially, each Fattah-2 carries sophisticated onboard electronic warfare suites. These systems can emit targeted jamming signals, release programmable decoys, and even spoof radar returns to create phantom targets. The combination turns a single missile into multiple apparent threats, forcing defensive systems to divide their attention. Now, contrast this with the Iron Beam. The Iron Beam is a high-power fiber laser weapon developed by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in cooperation with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Each battery typically consists of several laser emitters mounted on mobile platforms, supported by advanced radar and electro-optical tracking arrays. The system is designed to deliver a focused beam of coherent light at approximately 100 kilowatts of power. Instead of exploding on impact, the laser burns through the target's skin, damaging critical components or detonating the warhead through thermal stress. On paper, the Iron Beam offers revolutionary advantages. Each shot costs only a few dollars in electricity, compared to tens of thousands or even millions for kinetic interceptors. In theory, it provides near unlimited magazine depth as long as power and cooling are available. Israeli officials had promoted it as the perfect complement to the Iron Dome, handling short-range rockets and drones cheaply, while the more expensive systems dealt with longer-range threats. But the physics of laser weapons create inherent vulnerabilities when facing hypersonic targets. First is the dwell time problem. To destroy or disable a target, the laser must maintain a stable, concentrated beam on the same spot for several seconds. At Mach 15, a Fattah-2 glide vehicle covers nearly 5 kilometers every second. Even with perfect tracking, The beam must compensate for atmospheric turbulence, dust, humidity, and the target's rapid maneuvers. Any momentary loss of lock, even for a fraction of a second, resets the heating process. Second is the energy and thermal management challenge. Generating 100 kilowatts continuously produces enormous waste heat. After firing only a few sustained shots, the system's cooling mechanisms reach capacity. Lasers cannot simply reload like a missile launcher. They must pause to dissipate heat or risk melting their own optics and fiber cables. In the heat of battle, with multiple high-speed targets approaching simultaneously, this cooling requirement becomes a fatal bottleneck. Third, atmospheric effects significantly degrade laser performance. Moisture, dust, smoke, and even temperature gradients in the air can scatter or absorb the beam, reducing its effective range and power density. The Fattah-2's terminal approach often includes low-altitude flight paths that deliberately exploit these atmospheric layers. The economic asymmetry is equally striking. Each Fattah-2 is estimated to cost between $1.5 million and $2.5 million. In contrast, a single iron beam battery, including radars, power systems, and support vehicles, represents hundreds of millions of dollars in sunk capital. When 200 such missiles are launched in coordinated waves, the defender faces an impossible cost-exchange ratio. Billions in defensive infrastructure versus hundreds of millions in attacking weapons. Iran did not develop the Fattah-2 inches isolation. The program built upon years of incremental advances in solid fuel rocketry, guidance systems, and materials science, achieved despite international sanctions. The maneuverability demonstrated in the recent strike suggests sophisticated onboard inertial navigation combined with terminal seeker upgrades, possibly incorporating electro-optical or infrared sensors that are difficult to jam. The Iron Beam, while technologically impressive, was optimized for a different threat environment, primarily slow to medium-speed rockets, artillery shells, and drones. It was never designed as a primary counter to large numbers of highly maneuverable hypersonic vehicles. Its integration into Israel's broader air defense network assumed that kinetic systems would handle the high-end threats, leaving the laser to mop up cheaper, slower targets. The events of that night proved this division of labor fatally flawed. The Fattah-2 did not need to outsmart every sensor. It simply needed to arrive in sufficient numbers, fast enough, and with enough unpredictable motion to overwhelm the physical and thermal limits of the laser systems. In doing so, it exposed the uncomfortable truth that directed energy weapons, despite decades of investment, remain highly sensitive to saturation tactics when confronted by weapons operating at the extreme edge of atmospheric flight performance. With the technological mismatch now clear, the next obvious question is how such a large and complex operation could have caught both Israeli and American intelligence completely off guard. The failure was not a single mistake. It was a systemic collapse rooted in outdated assumptions, mismatched collection priorities, and a dangerous underestimation of Iranian operational discipline. For years, Western intelligence agencies had monitored Iran's missile program through satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, and occasional human sources. They observed test launches, noted improvements in accuracy, and tracked the expansion of underground facilities. Yet they consistently failed to connect these developments into a coherent picture of an imminent hypersonic saturation strike. The first critical blind spot was the focus on fixed infrastructure. American and Israeli satellites excel at identifying large missile silos, fixed launch pads, and major production halls. But the Fattah-2 operation relied on highly dispersed mobile launch teams. Missiles were transported in civilian-style convoys of commercial trucks, assembled in remote desert valleys and mountain hideouts, and launched from pre-surveyed temporary sites that left almost no persistent signature. Each launch team handled only a small number of missiles, never enough to trigger the analytical thresholds that would elevate attention. A second failure lay in the signals intelligence domain. During the preparation phase, Iranian teams used strict emission control protocols. Mission data, target coordinates, and attack sequencing parameters were loaded into the missile's onboard computers days or even weeks in advance at secure underground facilities. Once the missiles left their assembly points, communications were reduced to the absolute minimum. The Fattah-2 glide vehicles themselves operated with near-total radio silence during the approach phase, relying on pre-programmed inertial guidance and terminal autonomous seekers. The limited mesh coordination between missiles used burst transmissions on frequency-hopping bands that fell below the detection thresholds of most ground-based Israeli SIGINT stations. Even more damaging was the human intelligence shortfall. Penetrating Iran's hypersonic program proved extraordinarily difficult. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had compartmentalized the Fattah-2 development into small, tightly controlled cells. Engineers and technicians working on guidance systems had no visibility into launch planning, while operational commanders knew little about the technical specifications. Foreign recruitment efforts were systematically neutralized by Iran's counterintelligence apparatus, which had spent over a decade identifying and removing potential leaks. This operational security extended to deception tactics. Iran deliberately maintained visible activity around older ballistic missile sites, conducting routine tests and movements that reinforced the Western perception that any future strike would follow traditional patterns. Meanwhile, the real Fattah-2 assets operated in the shadows. Decoy convoys and false electronic signatures further diluted intelligence collection efforts. The timing of the attack exploited another institutional weakness: the assumption of predictable warning timelines. Israeli and American planners had calibrated their alert systems around the longer flight times of conventional ballistic missiles. The depressed trajectories and hypersonic speeds of the Fattah-2 slashed warning time to minutes rather than tens of minutes. By the time radars confirmed the incoming threat, the first wave was already transitioning into its terminal glide phase. Compounding these issues was a persistent analytical bias. For decades, Western intelligence assessments carried an implicit belief that sanctions would severely limit Iran's ability to field truly advanced systems. Reports routinely described Iranian missiles as crude or unsophisticated, despite mounting evidence of improved guidance packages, maneuverable re-entry vehicles, and indigenous materials capable of surviving hypersonic flight. This bias led analysts to downgrade the probability of a successful large-scale saturation attack, even when partial indicators appeared. Operationally, the strike demonstrated remarkable Iranian patience and planning. Launch windows were chosen during a period of reduced Israeli aerial surveillance and when key American assets were repositioned elsewhere in the region. Proxy forces in neighboring countries provided additional distraction through limited drone activity, further stretching defensive attention. The result was complete tactical surprise. When the first wave appeared on screens, Israeli commanders had only seconds to react. Command channels quickly became overloaded with conflicting reports and urgent requests for authorization. This confusion prevented the rapid, coordinated response needed to bring all available iron beam and kinetic systems online simultaneously. In the end, the intelligence failure was not primarily about missing a single piece of information. It was about failing to imagine that a sanctioned nation could orchestrate a sophisticated, low-signature, high-speed hypersonic operation at this scale while maintaining operational secrecy for months. This night exposed a deeper truth. Modern intelligence collection remains heavily biased toward observable, high-signature activities. Against an adversary that has mastered dispersion, emission control, compartmentalization, and strategic patience, those tools proved insufficient. Now we will explore how Iran built this hypersonic capability under decades of sanctions and isolation. Behind the dramatic success of the Fattah-2 lies something far more significant than a single weapon system. It is the culmination of a deliberate, long-term strategic doctrine that Iran calls resistance economy, a philosophy of technological sovereignty forged in the fires of isolation and necessity. After the 1979 revolution and the brutal 8-year war with Iraq, Iranian leaders reached a painful conclusion. Any nation dependent on foreign suppliers for critical defense technologies is inherently vulnerable. A single embargo or political decision could paralyze its military overnight. The only path to genuine security, they decided, was to build every essential capability domestically, no matter how difficult or expensive the journey. This doctrine became the driving force behind Iran's hypersonic program. From the very beginning, engineers and scientists were told that failure was not an option. They could not import advanced guidance systems, high-temperature materials, or precision manufacturing equipment. Everything had to be developed at home, often starting from basic industrial capabilities. The journey began with solid-fuel rocket motors. Iranian researchers reverse engineered and then improved upon Scud-era technology, gradually mastering composite casings, high-energy propellants, and thrust vectoring systems. Each incremental success fed the next stage. When international sanctions tightened, they responded by expanding domestic universities and research institutes focused exclusively on defense-related sciences. A new generation of engineers grew up believing that self-reliance was both a technical necessity and a point of national pride. Developing the Fattah-2 required breakthroughs in multiple disciplines simultaneously. Hypersonic flight demands materials that can survive temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius while maintaining structural integrity during violent maneuvers. Iran invested heavily in indigenous carbon-carbon composites and ceramic matrix materials. Guidance systems had to function under extreme G-forces and plasma interference that disrupts radio signals. Iranian teams created hardened inertial navigation units combined with AI-assisted terminal seekers that operate with minimal external input. What makes this achievement remarkable is the timeline. While Western nations poured billions into hypersonic research with access to global supply chains and supercomputing resources, Iran progressed under layers of sanctions that blocked even basic machine tools and electronic components. They circumvented these restrictions through creative engineering, parallel development tracks, and strategic patience that measured progress in decades rather than fiscal quarters. The doctrine also emphasized testing through real-world conditions. Rather than relying solely on controlled range firings, Iran used proxy battlefields as living laboratories. Operations in Yemen provided data on how hypersonic-capable systems perform against sophisticated radar networks. Hezbollah engagements offered insights into electronic warfare environments similar to those in Israel. Each test flight, each operational feedback loop, refined the algorithms, materials, and tactics. Failures were not hidden, they were dissected with ruthless honesty and fed back into the next design iteration. This patient, iterative approach stands in sharp contrast to many Western defense programs that suffer from cost overruns, schedule delays, and political pressure for quick results. Iran's model accepted slower initial progress in exchange for genuine self-sufficiency and systems that could not be disabled by cutting off foreign parts. At the command level, Iranian strategists developed a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. They studied how Western air defenses function, identified their reliance on expensive kinetic interceptors and power-hungry laser systems, and deliberately designed weapons to exploit those dependencies. The goal was never symmetric parity. It was to create capabilities that made high-tech defenses economically unsustainable. The human element cannot be overlooked. Iranian engineers worked with a sense of historic mission. Many had watched their country endure decades of isolation and pressure. The successful deployment of the Fattah-2 represented validation of their life's work and proof that determination and systematic investment could overcome technological blockades. This doctrine of technological sovereignty has now produced tangible strategic leverage. By mastering hypersonic weapons under sanctions, Iran has demonstrated that the old rules, where advanced military technology remained the exclusive domain of a few wealthy nations, no longer apply. A country long dismissed as backward in military science has forced the world's most sophisticated defense establishments to confront a new reality. The Fattah-2 is not merely a missile. It is living proof that consistent political will, sustained investment in human capital, and a refusal to accept technological dependency can reshape the balance of military power. The burning remains of the Iron Beam batteries represent more than a tactical defeat for Israel. They mark a strategic inflection point that will reshape military planning worldwide. The most immediate consequence is the collapse of confidence in expensive, layered missile defense architectures. For decades, nations have invested billions in systems like Iron Dome, Patriot, THAAD, and now directed energy weapons, believing that technological superiority could neutralize quantitative threats. The Fattah-2 strike demonstrated that a determined adversary using hypersonic weapons and saturation tactics can render these costly shields economically unsustainable, and operationally fragile. This reality carries profound implications for the United States. American carrier strike groups, long considered the ultimate power projection tool, depend heavily on layered air and missile defenses. If a sanctioned nation like Iran can overwhelm advanced laser systems with 200 hypersonic missiles, the vulnerability of U.S. naval assets to similar massed attacks from China or Russia becomes impossible to ignore. Pentagon planners must now urgently reassess the survivability of forward-deployed forces in high-threat environments. NATO countries are watching with equal concern. Many European militaries have bet their defense strategies on American technology and integrated air defense networks. The events of that night exposed the risk of over-reliance on systems that can be saturated by cheaper, faster weapons. Defense budgets across the alliance will face pressure to shift resources toward hypersonic countermeasures, distributed sensors, and resilient command networks rather than traditional high-value platforms. The demonstration has also sent a powerful message to the global South. Nations that have long been told security requires purchasing expensive Western weapon systems now see an alternative path. Iran's success under sanctions proves that sustained domestic investment and strategic patience can produce capabilities capable of challenging even the most advanced defenses. Countries from Latin America to Southeast Asia will study this model closely as they evaluate their own defense industrialization strategies. For Russia and China, the strike serves as both validation and acceleration. Russia has already incorporated Iranian drone technology and will likely seek deeper cooperation on hypersonic glide vehicles. China, with its far greater industrial base and computing resources, is positioned to scale similar concepts to theater-wide operations. The balance of conventional deterrence in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea may shift faster than previously anticipated. At the deepest level, this event challenges the post-Cold War assumption that Western technological and financial dominance would remain unchallenged in military affairs. The old paradigm, where a handful of nations controlled the cutting edge of warfare, is fracturing. A new era is emerging in which technological sovereignty, asymmetric innovation, and the willingness to endure prolonged isolation can offset traditional measures of military power. The $5 billion Iron Beam did not fail because it was poorly engineered. It failed because the strategic environment had changed. Speed, maneuverability, numbers, and low unit cost, when combined with disciplined operational art, have begun to outweigh the advantages of exquisite but expensive technology. The world has entered an age where the cost curve of offense has decisively outpaced the cost curve of defense. Nations that recognize this shift and adapt their doctrines, procurement strategies, and alliance structures accordingly will shape the coming decades. Those that cling to yesterday's assumptions risk discovering too late that the rules of the game have already been rewritten. The 12 minutes that destroyed the Iron Beam were not merely a military engagement, they were the opening chapter of a new global strategic reality. So, where does this leave us? The destruction of Israel's $5 billion Iron Beam by 200 Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles in just 12 minutes has forced a fundamental reckoning. The age of relying on expensive, high-tech defensive shields to guarantee security is rapidly coming to an end. What happened that night was not simply the loss of a weapon system. It was the exposure of a deeper strategic imbalance. When offense can be produced at a fraction of the cost of defense and delivered with overwhelming speed and numbers, the entire logic of deterrence through technological superiority begins to unravel. For Israel, the dilemma is immediate and painful. Its traditional instruments of ground dominance and rapid decisive response have been constrained by the demonstrated vulnerability of its air defense network. Any large-scale military operation now carries the risk of devastating attrition before forces can even cross the border. The comforting assumption that superior technology could always compensate for geographic disadvantages has been shattered along with the laser batteries. For the United States, the implications run even deeper. Washington must now confront the limits of its security guarantees in the region. The rapid repositioning of American forces revealed the uncomfortable truth that even the world's most powerful military can be forced into defensive adjustments when faced with determined hypersonic saturation attacks. Future planning can no longer treat missile defense as a reliable backstop. It must be reimagined as one fragile layer among many in an increasingly contested battle space. Globally, this single night has accelerated the transition toward a multipolar military order. Nations that once accepted technological dependency on Western suppliers are now reassessing their options. The proven ability of a sanctioned state to develop and deploy game-changing hypersonic capabilities has rewritten the rulebook. The message is clear: strategic patience, domestic investment, and asymmetric innovation can challenge even the most heavily funded defense architectures. The era in which a few advanced powers could dictate the terms of conventional conflict through superior technology alone is fading. In its place emerges a more complex reality where the balance between offense and defense, cost and capability, and political will and industrial base will determine who holds the advantage. The burning iron beam batteries do not lie. The 12 minutes of that night do not lie. A new chapter in modern warfare has opened, and the world is watching to see who will adapt fastest. We will continue to track every development as this story unfolds, from shifting alliances and revised defense budgets to the next potential escalation cycle. If you want to stay ahead of mainstream narratives and understand the real forces reshaping global power, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update when the next major shift occurs. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to grasp what is actually happening beyond the headlines. Because in an age of information overload, clear, technically grounded strategic insight has never been more valuable. Thank you for watching.